Welcome to another session of our CRP Colloquium series, and a special welcome to the prospective Masters of Regional Planning students who are joining us today via Zoom, I think. So today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Jacob Anbinder, who is a historian of the modern United States with a particular focus on the politics of cities and suburbs in the 20th century. His research interests include the political economy of major infrastructure projects, movements for and against change to the built environment, and the ways in which sprawl and spatial segregation create social inequalities. His current book project, Cities of Amber, Antigrowth Politics and the Making of Modern Liberalism, is the first history of the modern urban cost of living crisis, the origins of the liberal NIMBY, and their role in making the modern Democratic Party. Dr. Anbinder's writing has been published in The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, U.S. News & World Report, Business History Review, The Week, Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and other outlets. He received a PhD in history from Harvard University in 2023 and is now a Klarman Fellow here at Cornell. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Jake, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. I think that's the first time I've ever been introduced as doctor, and I have to say it feels kind of good. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. I want to thank Wen-Fei and everyone else who's made this spring colloquium possible. I was particularly excited when I was told that the talk would be in this room because historians never give talks in rooms that look like this, suffice to say. This is much, much nicer. You think of a typical history talk, you think of like a church basement. That's the kind of aesthetic that I'm more used to. So this is very exciting for me, using a microphone and everything. So you'll forgive me if I'm a little too loud or too quiet because I'm not used to all these accoutrements. But as Wen-Fei said, my name is Jake Anbinder. I'm an American historian and currently a Klarman Fellow here at Cornell. And this talk today, as she said, is derived from my current book project, Cities of Amber, Antigrowth Politics and the Making of Modern Liberalism. So apart from being in this fancy room, another reason I was very excited to speak here today is having spent the majority of the past 6 years trying to convince historians that they should care about the housing crisis, this is really one of my first opportunities to talk to a bunch of people who care about housing and convince them that they should care about the history of the housing crisis. And so I think the right way to frame my talk today is precisely that. Why have a historian participate in a colloquium on city and regional planning? What do we gain by learning the history of this housing crisis that we're all facing? In popular imagination, we think of history as a way to learn the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them again. But unfortunately, this story is not as straightforward as that. In fact, what I came to conclude studying this issue is it's really exactly the opposite. The story of our housing crisis is, in large part, not really one of bad decisions that should have been obvious to people at the time, but of a subtle and largely inadvertent convergence of ideological trends that came out of the political economy of post-war America and really out of people's deliberate attempts to improve the cities and suburbs in which they lived. So what I want to do over the next hour or so is take you on a whirlwind tour of this history, the history of this thing that I call anti-growth politics. And I want to do this in roughly 6 stages. I'll start by explaining how I came to this topic. Then I kind of want to give you a broad sweep of the history that the project covers, starting with a brief look into what it was that anti-growth politics emerged in opposition to, what shape that vague anti-growth impulse first took, how it was married to a structural critique of liberalism, and then what were a few of the actual policies and laws that resulted from this new breed of left-of-center politics in the last decades of the 20th century in the places where it was most influential. And then I'll conclude by looking at the implications and lessons of anti-growth politics in our time. So, how this project really came to be starts with my own experience looking for rental housing after college. First in New York City, where I worked for a think tank, then in Boston for graduate school, and really even to an extent recently here in Ithaca. And as I'm sure many of you know, the experience of looking for housing these days is pretty miserable. The housing is in such bad condition for the most part. It's so expensive and so scarce. And in New York City in particular, when you showed up in the afternoon to look at an apartment that had been posted that morning, you were expected to have with you your pay stubs, your checkbook, your references, your bank statements, and maybe even sometimes your parents' bank statements, and I don't have to go into all the unequal implications of that. And there would be a dozen or 24 people looking at the apartment right along beside you, and if you didn't apply right there in person, you were not going to get that apartment. And so as you can imagine, this insane housing situation really started to bother me. And when I first started talking about the idea for this project, a common reaction I got from people was, well, these cities have always been expensive. It's always been this way. And I quickly found out that that really just wasn't true, or at least it wasn't true to nearly the extent that it is today. We know, for example, that rent has outpaced income growth in cities. Here you see a chart of cost-burdened renters. At the top there, that's renters. That's defined as renters who pay more than 30% of their income to rent. Though, as we were talking about yesterday, this was actually raised at some point in the past from 25%. That used to be the rule of thumb. And when rents simply got too high, they just changed the number that they considered burdened. And then the lower line here you see is severely cost-burdened. That's people who pay more than 50% of their income to rent. And so, as you can see, these numbers have been going up quite a bit since the 60s. And the more that I looked into how this came to be, the more that I realized you don't need a Nobel Prize in economics to figure out why. Here you have a chart of per capita home building in the US, and as you can see, it peaks in the early 70s and goes down, and of course it fluctuates with the business cycle. But note how each boom period that we've had since the early 70s has a peak that's lower than the last one, and each recession has a trough that's lower than the last one, which is to say that even today, with the lowest unemployment in the US in 60 years, we are just barely building as much housing per capita as during the recessions of the late 20th century, which is something crazy, I think, to think about. So we have more people in the US than ever before, and you might argue because of the nature of the modern US economy, we have demand for housing concentrated in fewer cities than ever before, and yet we are building fewer and fewer homes to live in than at any time in recent memory. So to just give you a kind of brief sense of the difference between the slow growth areas that I'm going to talk about today and the high growth areas in the country, here you have a selection of some of the cities I'm going to mention today: LA, San Francisco, New York, and I included Tompkins County there. You see, in some ways, it could be characterized as a kind of slow growth area, though without really the same demand until, you could argue, quite recently. And then you compare that to some of the high growth parts of the country: Austin, Raleigh, Phoenix, and you see that there's an appreciable local difference in how much housing per capita has been permitted. So that is to say, not only do we have a chronic housing shortage, but as you can tell from these examples, this housing cost crisis has a particular geographic pattern. And I was noticing when I was building this PowerPoint that the highest tranche here is over $1.90 per square foot. When I lived with my wife in Harvard Square in grad school, granted it was a very good location, we were paying nearly $5 per square foot in rent. So those red areas that you see there, they don't really even capture, I think, the severity of the cost of living in those places these days. And that geographic pattern that I mentioned has a particular political pattern. So what you see here is the cost of housing in all 50 states indexed to 1980, so that's why they all kind of start at the same baseline in 1980, relative to the national average cost of housing. So where you have lines that are above 100%, that means that that state has above the national average housing costs. And where you see lines below 100%, that means the state has below national average housing costs. So you see that there's a particular partisan pattern here, where almost without exception, the most expensive places to live in the country are blue states, and the less expensive places to live in the country are red states. So all this is to say, the cost of living crisis in the US today and the lack of home building that I'm arguing is its primary cause are not just urban problems. They're particularly acute problems in the urban areas that are, by pretty much anyone's definition, the base of the modern Democratic Party and the heart of liberal America. And that's really the question at the heart of my project. How did we get to this point where America's most ostensibly progressive cities are too expensive for most Americans to live in. So, as I began to think about this question, I came to conclude that it was not coincidence, nor was it a failure of liberal policies per se, in the sense of a story of Democrats trying to accommodate this demand to live in cities and failing to do so. Rather, what I came to conclude was there's an ideological basis to this history that's related to these cities' emergent identities as the base of the modern Democratic Party. You go back to the years immediately before World War II, Democrats in cities across the country were emphatically supportive of what the sociologist Harvey Molotch called the growth machine. But you get to the end of the 20th century, Democrats in cities and suburbs are much more skeptical of, and in many cases downright hostile toward, not only urban growth itself, but also the idea that such growth was in any way compatible with liberalism as they now defined it. And so it's out of this premise that I began to develop this idea of what I call anti-growth politics. There was this moment in time when the question of urban growth itself became extremely contested, and this was inextricable from the changes that were taking place at the same time nationwide in the composition and priorities of the Democratic Party. In particular, there was this idea that in its relentless quest for economic prosperity, America had lost sight of the things that made life worth living. Another was the idea that the pro-growth liberalism associated with FDR's New Deal was deeply implicated in the emergence of this problem. And a third idea was that the continued growth of cities was not merely a symptom of this disease, but was a major cause of it. What you see here, these photos make the rounds on the internet from time to time of, you have the classic Black Lives Matter, in this house we believe sign, and then the anti-upzoning sign right here. So this encapsulates the phenomenon that I'm describing, and I always love when I see one of these in the wild. This is not my photo, but I've taken similar photos of this, mostly in Berkeley, as you might imagine. So anyway, I'm going to spare you my whole spiel that I reserve for when I talk to rooms of historians about how this project fits kind of historiographically into recent scholarship. Frankly, even when the rooms are full of historians, I don't think they care that much, so I know that you guys really, really don't care. But I do want to talk about a choice that I made in how I'm framing this project, which I allude to in the title of the lecture today. And that is the choice to not use the term NIMBY, or not in my backyard. So I have to imagine that nearly everyone here is familiar with the concept of NIMBY or NIMBYism. Is there anyone who is not familiar? I think it's virtually universally recognized today as a kind of modern-day political problem. And here you see the kind of obligatory Google Ngram chart. The earliest reference the Oxford English Dictionary can find is 1979. I suspect it's actually a little bit before that. But in any case, it explodes in use over the 80s and 90s, makes its way into newspaper headlines, like you see here, and it's only done this with greater and greater frequency in this century. So I'll confess that this is a little bit of a sleight of hand, that my relationship with the term NIMBY is complicated. And I plead guilty to describing my work sometimes as a history of NIMBYism. You're taught in grad school that if you're at a conference and, God forbid, you run into an editor or a search chair, you have to have that elevator pitch for your book ready to go, and it's just a great shorthand. So I understand why it's become so widely used. But the more that I have studied this issue, the more that I've come to conclude that NIMBYism as a term and an idea, they've really had their day. And in fact, I think our overuse of the term, is itself a sign of how surprisingly rudimentary our understanding has been of where anti-growth politics came from. And this, in turn, I think, limits our understanding of how to counter it, and in doing so, how to start to fix this housing shortage that's plaguing so many parts of the country today. Because to me, NIMBYism implies a few things. First, it implies that growth opposition is mainly an effort to avoid the highly localized effects of discrete development projects. Too much traffic, too few parking spaces, too many students in the local schools, and the like. Now, I want to be clear, I don't deny that this dynamic is the source of a considerable amount of popular opposition to growth. But focusing on it to the exclusion of all others poses two fundamental problems, I think. First, it ignores the significant amount of anti-growth activism that was not hyper-local, but instead worked at the level of the neighborhood, the city, the state, or even the country, in order to structure slowdowns in growth across much larger geographies. And I think if we remove the blinkers of the NIMBY framework, we start to see thematic connections among a much wider array of political events than before. And when you do that, I really think it's impossible to not to conclude that participants in the growth revolt saw the stakes of their work as being much greater than keeping one building or another out of their own backyards. Now, the second issue I have with the idea of the NIMBY is, in its local emphasis, the concept lends itself to one-dimensional, overly materialistic interpretations of anti-growthers' motives. Opponents of development, this is the famous theory, are economically rational home voters. That's the term coined by William Fischel, whose politics derive from a fundamental interest in maintaining the value of their property. Any more high-minded goals they have must therefore necessarily be attempts to cover up their greed. As the title of a recent journal article on the topic noted, growth politics is supposedly a place where self-interest trumps ideology. But I think that this overly materialist interpretation of the growth revolt suffers from a kind of teleological problem. Because we know today that growth control policies helped bring about increased home values, we assume that their purpose must have been to do that. And because so much political research into NIMBYism has relied on surveys of homeowner opinions, we run the risk of predetermining our own conclusions about the nature of that opposition. Today, I want to take a different tack, because I think that when you examine the long sweep of anti-growth activism through the lens of 20th century political history, you start to see why the kind of vulgar materialistic point of view is really insufficient for making sense of the growth revolt. You do have examples of homeowners defending their blocks against the bulldozer, but you also have activism that really bears very little resemblance to that kind of Jane Jacobs versus Robert Moses caricature. One study on the rise of anti-growth politics in California found no relationship between a municipality's likelihood of enacting growth control measures and the actual amount of growth that town had experienced within its own borders. So just as the anti-growthers kind of sat underneath what we like to call the Democratic Party's big tent, their movement itself was broad enough to incorporate a lot of different reasons for opposing growth. You had think tank experts who cared about the devastating effects of sprawl, architectural aficionados who waxed eloquent about saving old buildings, weekend outdoorsmen fighting to preserve a particularly beloved trail or beach, and most importantly, a vast sea of Democrats who really didn't have much interest in this topic at all, but who became persuaded through the power of party and the power of ideology that growth control was consistent with their identities as liberals. The historian Eric Foner once observed that ideology represents much more than the convenient rationalization of material interests. Instead, he wrote, it's a profoundly successful fusion of value and interest. So in other words, in my opinion, this is not a story of self-interest trumping ideology. It's a story in which this political movement found enduring success by causing self-interest and ideology to fuse in new and unexpected ways. Because if that weren't the case, anti-growth politics would have never been as successful as it was. In order for it to work, you needed to bring in the ex-New Dealers. You needed to bring in leftists. You needed to bring in moderates who are abandoning the Republican Party in this time, as it turns to the right, who believed together that what they were doing was practicing a version of democratic politics that in some ways was more authentic and more likely to achieve the goals that they believed liberalism's pro-growth iteration had failed to achieve. And I think that once you start to understand this, you start to have a better sense of the deeply intertwined relationship between this thing that we now call liberalism and the arc of urban history over the last 50, 60 years. Across the parts of the country that today have the highest concentrations of Democratic voters, Democratic elected officials, donors to Democratic campaigns, and professions like architecture, like history, maybe to a lesser extent, professions that shape kind of the culture of liberalism, the late 20th and early 20th centuries are really defined by the overwhelming demand to live in such places, running up against their legally mandated inability to accommodate that demand. So we have to take the anti-growthers seriously as scholars, not as a kind of sideshow to the rise of Trumpism and the far right, or to the decline of the industrial working class, which is something that historians like to talk a lot about, but really as a central element of how our modern-day party system came to be, and particularly within that system, how the Democrats evolved into a party of increasingly white-collar, urban and suburban voters, concentrated, like you see here, on the coasts, with all the implications that has had for both the priorities of the party and the success of its electoral coalition. So what is this thing that I'm calling anti-growth politics? Where did it come from? How did it evolve? Who subscribed to it? How did its constituent elements work together? Where did it succeed? Where did it fail? I really think this starts with understanding what it was reacting against. And that, in turn, starts with understanding the tremendous physical impact that post-war growth had on the American urban landscape. So, as pretty much everyone in this room probably knows, you had the rapid suburbanization of the United States after World War II, made possible by the construction of a massive national highway network and by New Deal programs that created a market for low-interest government-backed mortgages. You see here on the right, this is a New Yorker cartoon from the early 60s. I don't know if you can make it out. It says, "Quick, get your gun, pa, here come the suburbs." You have the bulldozers coming over the hill there. And then on the left, this is Daly City, California, which is just south of San Francisco. And it's actually this neighborhood that inspired Malvina Reynolds to write the song Little Boxes, which you might know. It was made famous by Pete Seeger. Actually, it charted, it was on the Billboard Hot 100 in the 60s. So songs like that really expressed people's interest and fear of this kind of rampant suburbanization that was going on. But the suburbs were not the only place that growth liberalism's effects could be seen. In cities like New Haven, Connecticut, which you see here, you had urban renewal programs intended to fight suburbanization by keeping downtown commerce appealing and urban living appealing as well. Here you see a great example of a kind of before and after shot. This is the Route 34 connector. This kind of bulldozed what had been a largely Jewish neighborhood. And then you have the Route 34 completed here, along with the Knights of Columbus Tower and the New Haven Coliseum. And these sorts of projects were kind of very common as part of urban renewal. But it's important to note how urban renewal failed to live up to expectations. By March 1961, the number of homes demolished under urban renewal was nearly 5 times greater than the number built. And the social problems for which it had been touted as a solution seemed more intractable than ever. Crime was up, juvenile delinquency was up, those who could afford to leave the city for the suburbs continued to do so. Many black people reconcentrated in the older, lower quality housing that had not been marked for demolition, or in the relatively small number of new public housing projects. And this is the phenomenon that the historian Arnold Hirsch memorably called the making of the second ghetto. The first ghetto being the kind of both formal and informal segregation that black people faced right after the Great Migration. Then the second ghetto being this reconcentration of black people in cities in these kind of post-renewal neighborhoods. In some ways, though, things were not much better back in the suburbs. Though outwardly happier, wealthier places than the inner city, the sprawl was coming under its own criticism from people who argued that beneath the kind of thin veneer of middle-class prosperity symbolized by landscapes like this lurked a mode of existence that was both environmentally wasteful and psychologically unfulfilling. So around this time, you have a new wave of public discourse in the US that really becomes quite cynical about both urban and suburban life. The editor of the magazine Architectural Forum wrote that he saw in the suburbs cheap and alienating character, an indication that America's hard-edged, capitalistic society was headed toward long-term decline. He argued that it was a physical environment that was thrown up overnight, kind of pumped for money, and then demolished as soon as a more profitable use for the land was found. And this cycle of planned obsolescence, he argued, was wasteful, greedy, and dehumanizing. And it was turning America into what he called the biggest slum on the face of the earth. And so I want to kind of pause there for a second to underscore how examples like this show how this new growth skepticism wasn't really just architectural or aesthetic criticism. It was an effort to link these kind of pernicious social trends in American society to the built environment itself. Pointing to tangible physical changes that were taking place in cities and suburbs, critics of growth argued that these changes really came from a fundamentally flawed idea of progress. And its effects could be seen not just in the form of physical deterioration, but also in the paradox, this was quite widely felt at the time, that many Americans believed their quality of life was declining even in an era of unprecedented national prosperity. Kind of reminds you of today, doesn't it? So what you get as a result of all this is an emergent popular demand, mostly but not exclusively associated with the left of center, for a politics that would grapple with this problem, that would grapple with the problems presented by growth. And pretty soon, you see these kind of inchoate impulses start to coalesce into tangible laws with real-life impacts. So there are two policy areas in particular, one that's kind of largely suburban and one that's largely urban, that I want to focus on today, because I think they really point to the reconfigured priorities of people who were either already liberals or who, through this kind of reconfiguration, were starting to think of themselves more as liberals. And they point to the ways in which kind of distinct but related strains of anti-growth politics were emerging in different parts of metro areas, kind of on both sides of the country. The first of these that I want to talk about is a reinvigorated interest in historic preservation, particularly in the Northeast. So here you see on the left probably the most famous example of a failed preservation effort. That's the effort to save Penn Station. And on the right, a more successful movement. Here you see Jackie O, the movement to save Grand Central. And not only Jackie O, but here you have future mayor of New York City, Ed Koch. So in 1945, just 2 American cities had laws designed to protect landmarks. By the time you get to the 60s, the number had grown to 64. And no better place exemplified this turn than New York City. Even in the 50s, New York's most ardent preservationists had estimated there were no more than a few hundred structures in the city that ought to be landmarked. Yet by the end of the 60s, as you see on this chart here, nearly 5,000 properties citywide enjoyed protected status. And by the end of the 70s, that number had surpassed 10,000. And as you see with the title of this chart, much of this was done through a new tool, the historic district, which bestowed the same landmark protections as you had with individual buildings like Grand Central across entire neighborhoods of the city in one fell swoop. And the emergence of the historic district is important in this story because it really underscores a change in who the preservationists were. You go back to the kind of 30s, 40s, 50s, landmarking had really been a kind of niche interest of a very small clique of very upper class, kind of old Knickerbocker families, the oldest of the old New York elites, quite conservative, mostly Republicans in this era. But by the time you get to the 60s, you start to see a new group, who you might call neighborhood preservationists. And these were new arrivals like you see here. These are images from a New York City document, a report that was put out in the 60s or 70s. I love these photos. The one on the left here, that's like a house party that was thrown by a homeowner in Brooklyn Heights. Here you have an ad talking about Boerum Hill in the middle here, and then a mother and her daughter in a renovated kitchen in their Park Slope brownstone on the right. So these are the people I'm talking about. These people, they were in their 20s, 30s, 40s, liberal, married with few or no children. They worked in white-collar professions, architecture, academia. They'd gone to college or even graduate school. And these people kind of made a different argument for why preservation was important. They argued that historic districts attracted well-to-do residents like themselves, and their tax revenue and their investment dollars that in these days were so desperately sought by cities. And this was an important argument because it argued that the same ends that urban renewal sought to achieve, which was to kind of bring white, upper middle class people, bring their investment dollars back to the city, could be achieved through preservation rather than through renewal, through minimal physical intervention in the city rather than maximal physical intervention. And so I think this is really important because in the grand scheme of all of New York City, the number of landmark buildings remains relatively small. It's I think, about 10% in Manhattan and a little bit lower in the outer boroughs, or quite a bit lower in the outer boroughs. But I do think that this was important because preservation gave this kind of anti-growth sentiment the imprimatur of a liberal cause that it retains to this day. And these neighborhood preservationists did so by offering an affirmative vision through which people like themselves could articulate objections to the highways, the high-rises, and the other modernist schemes that were trying to stanch the flow of people and capital from cities. And I think their activism really helped bring about the collapse of the previous liberal orthodoxy that had promoted metropolitan growth and laid the groundwork for a new urban politics that was far more skeptical of physical changes to the city. So the second major policy area in which you see evidence of a growth revolt is environmentalism. Here, as part of a much broader environmental consciousness that was developing on the left, you have the emergence of what I would call a kind of anti-growth environmentalism, which blended fears of the kind of global effects of overpopulation with a more local side that focused on protecting open space as a way to prevent local overpopulation. And so the result was a kind of hybrid political movement within the much broader sphere of environmentalism, which argued that opposition to uncontrolled urban growth should be a central cause of environmentalist work. Now, this is a largely overlooked aspect of environmentalism in this era, but it was very influential, particularly on the West Coast. And by 1974, an analysis from the New York Times had found nearly every state in the country had passed some form of legislation intended to improve physical quality of life. And together, the Times called this a land use revolution. Even as environmentalism became increasingly associated with the Democratic Party in this era, though, there was sometimes a pretty obvious illiberal undercurrent to this particular kind of environmental politics. And here you have one of my favorite examples. In Oregon, you start to see homemade signs like these. Some of them appear at rest areas on I-5 at the state border with California, and they tell visitors the state was, quote, a wonderful place to visit, but you are not invited to stay. And the state's centrist Republican governor at the time, Tom McCall, who was known as a kind of conservationist, he makes national headlines in 1971 when he publicly asked that people stop moving to Oregon. And this was quite radical for a governor at the time. I don't think anyone could recall a time when a governor had asked people to stop moving to his state. But maybe the most prominent example of this kind of harder-edged anti-growth environmentalism was California. There in 1968, you have the biologist Paul Ehrlich, who you see here, published his manifesto called The Population Bomb, which was about what he believed to be the planet's impending population crisis. This book became one of the best-selling scientific books of its time. It went through 22 reprints in 4 years, and as you see here, he was invited on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson 18 times. And it's really, it's hard to grasp this today, but this was one of the most popular shows in America at a time when there wasn't much choice. Everyone kind of watched the same thing. And so he became really a household name. And I suspect if you have not heard of Paul Ehrlich, though most of you probably have, your parents have certainly heard of Paul Ehrlich. This book was really a kind of national phenomenon of a sort that in our kind of more diversified media landscape today, you really don't have anymore. So you might remember the population bomb today for its kind of lurid descriptions of developing countries, which are quite, in hindsight, quite racist and have made the book age quite poorly. So that's really what it's best remembered for today. But it's worth remembering how critical the population bomb also was of growth in the US. Ehrlich called the US an overdeveloped country, and he blamed urbanization for our overcrowded highways, burgeoning slums, deteriorating schools, rising tax and crime rates, riots, and other social disorders. And the arguments that he made had a clear influence on politics in certain parts of the US pretty quickly. A 1973 survey of residents in San Mateo County, just south of San Francisco, found that 83% wished for there to be no new population growth within the county's borders. You had local chapters of the Sierra Club who began to hold population workshops that would, in the Sierra Club's words, make the link between community opposition to more housing and the need for an overall end to population growth. One Sierra Club member said in 1971, there is no more humane way to limit population than to limit housing. So between preservation and environmentalism, what you're seeing in the 70s and on the political left or center left was what I would call a kind of spatial ideology, a kind of politics where liberals were starting to express ideas about how society ought to function through the lens of fights over the appearance of the landscape itself. And this was a very different mode of politics from the kind of the dynamic that had existed before, where very roughly, and this is a gross oversimplification, you had a kind of pro-labor mode of politics on the left and a pro-capital mode of politics on the right. So this really doesn't fit into that framework very easily. And as you might guess, it didn't take long for some old guard liberals to note the conceptual problems with it. One of the most prominent voices was civil rights movement leader Bayard Rustin, who you see here. In a 1976 New York Times op-ed, he railed against the, quote, exquisitely honed sense of self-righteousness and moral sensitivity of these new liberals and the strivings of the educated middle-class elite from which they came. And he ends with this wonderful quote, far from being a passing fad, the willingness to abandon growth at once symbolizes and contributes to the weakening of liberal will and liberal vision in the West. We're told that the byword of the future is to be retrenchment, that we will have to make do with less, even though we are assured a future with less will be superior to the present. It's so magnificently written. And so I think this quote really raises an important question. Why did this new anti-growth politics, which seemed to people like Rustin to be so antithetical to what liberalism had stood for before, why does it end up being so enduring? And specifically enduring as an identifiably liberal phenomenon? And the answer to that, I think, really lies in how anti-growth did not remain just a set of kind of discrete policy ideas, like saving a building or stopping population growth. Rather, these things were linked to a much more structural critique of liberalism that was being made in the 60s, that was saying that the way liberalism functioned before had been discredited, and liberalism ought to look and function a different way. And if that change could be summed up in a single word, I think it was decentralization. There was a decentralist impulse that emerged in the 60s, often articulated as a quest for community control, a term that those of you who have taken planning classes here or elsewhere are probably quite familiar with. So I want to be very clear. The ideas behind community control are not inherently congruent with the ideas behind anti-growth politics. You have many people in this era who were pro-community control but pro-growth. And you have a lot of people who were kind of anti-growth but believe that that stopping growth was a goal that should be achieved kind of top-down through regional or state or federal action. So these things are not completely overlapping. However, I think community control helped anti-growth politics gain purchase within people's broader ideas of what kind of the next generation of liberal urban policy ought to look like. And there were three groups that I see as being particularly influential in this story. The first was the so-called New Left. Whether at Berkeley, which you see here in the early 60s, or similar places across the country, the prevailing attitude among this young generation of leftists was that liberalism had not just failed on a programmatic level. In other words, it wasn't just that liberal policies had failed or that they had been implemented poorly. Rather, they believed that liberalism had failed on a spiritual level by inhibiting the creative and humanistic capacities of society. And so to the New Left, the idea of the small community really came to hold a lot of value as kind of the counterweight to their idea of corporations dominating kind of big politics, particularly defense contractors. The Vietnam War is kind of the issue that looms over this entire era of history, but also to the alienating tendencies they saw in post-war life in cities. But even though the New Left contributed quite a lot to this thinking, establishment liberals were also kind of moving in the same direction already. Under Robert C. Weaver, who was LBJ's HUD secretary, you see here, he was also the first African-American member of a cabinet. Great Society initiatives like the Community Action Program, or CAP, were premised on the theory that one of the most direct ways to fight poverty was to put federal funds straight in the hands of grassroots organizations, rather than have programs be managed by kind of distant Washington bureaucrats. One pamphlet explained that under CAP, the individual community decides how best to attack poverty in its midst. And the program was required to be developed, conducted, and administered with the maximum feasible participation of residents of the areas and members of the groups served. And that phrase, kind of maximum feasible participation, is the phrase that became indelibly associated with this era and this kind of side of Great Society politics. And then a final group I think was particularly influential in promoting decentralist ideas was urban planners themselves. By the time you get to the 70s, you have planners who begin to speak of their work as advocacy planning, or plural planning, or community planning, a process of kind of ascertaining local needs rather than a top-down practice of applying their own knowledge as experts toward imposing requirements on communities. And I think this is largely still the paradigm in urban planning today, though feel free, we can discuss that in the Q&A if you'd like. Yet, as many noted at the time, including a lot of planners who considered themselves to be left of center, there were a lot of unanswered questions about what community control even meant. What happened if community consensus was impossible to achieve? What if a community itself seemed kind of illiberal? And here, too, Baird Rustin offered a prescient critique. He wrote in Harper's Magazine in 1970, "One cannot question the value or importance of democratic participation in the government, but just as misplaced sympathy for Negroes is being put to use by segregationists, the liberal preoccupation with localism is serving the cause of conservatism." So it's with Rustin's observation I want to segue into the next part of this talk, because it's really in the last few decades of the 20th century you start to see whether or not his critique of this emergent orientation within liberalism, what you might call kind of neighborhood liberalism, community liberalism, just kind of a small liberalism in general, in contrast to the big liberalism that had characterized the New Deal, you start to see how that pans out. And in particular, you start to see how it pans out in how it intersects with debates over metropolitan growth. So first, I want to return to New York City. You have in the 70s in New York new laws and processes that slow the pace of growth by requiring community input and devolving power away from the centralized institutions, like you see here, that were once very influential in planning the city's development. And the main conduit for this process was the New York City community boards. In the 70s, you have public demand that results in reforms to the boards that made them much more powerful figures in the city's development policy. A new land use review procedure, which still exists today, is created, which essentially gives the boards veto power over new housing, new highways, and pretty much anything else that was proposed for a community district. As you might imagine, research into these boards very quickly found many ways in which they actually functioned as checks on democratic power rather than democratic institutions in and of themselves. One study found that only a third of New Yorkers had ever heard of the community boards. Just 6% could name the community district in which they lived, and only 3% could describe with any accuracy what it was the boards did. Nearly a quarter of residents of the Upper West Side had attended a board meeting, a figure that I find incredible, but the same was only true for 2% of people in the South Bronx. And this discrepancy, as you might guess, had a predictable effect on what the boards were and were not able to accomplish. While you had community boards in poor neighborhoods that were mostly ineffective, by the end of the 70s, the community boards in wealthier neighborhoods had established a reputation as a force to be taken seriously, specifically in the city's growth politics. And they did so by helping legitimize the idea that neighborhood consultation was a natural component of the development process. As the chair of one board explained, community boards oppose development when it has a negative impact on the community. That's what they are for. So in the same neighborhoods that had been at the center of historic preservation fights, the boards opposed high-rises, hot dog stands, and any other project that really kind of threatens their idea of city living. And the hot dog stands thing is not an exaggeration. I found when I was researching this, a petition against a Nathan's hot dog stand in Greenwich Village that was signed by hundreds of homeowners, one of whom was Jane Jacobs. So if you take nothing away from this talk, take away the fact that Jane Jacobs once signed a petition against a hot dog stand. So sometimes the class and racial politics of these boards' demands were not very subtle. One prominent case was the early 70s fight over public housing in Forest Hills, Queens, where the city had proposed to build 800 apartments in what was then considered to be a pretty liberal and largely Jewish neighborhood. And many residents of Forest Hills suspected, and they were pretty much correct in this suspicion, that they had been chosen as the site of the public housing because as liberals, they were less likely to oppose it than the kind of Irish, Italian, more conservative parts of the outer boroughs. But this was not what happened. Instead, you have what you see here on the right, a mob of locals gathered at the intended site of the housing project and threw flaming torches and rocks at the construction trailers parked there. while at the same time, a couple blocks away, you have an overflow crowd at a local community center where one person held a sign. I don't know if you can make it out there in the back. What does it say? Forest Hills demands community control. So these protesters were not successful ultimately in stopping construction of the housing project, but they did extract significant concessions. The city agreed to cut the amount of new housing in half and only admit tenants who already lived in the neighborhood. So when the apartments opened a few years later, it surprised no one that 70% of the tenants were white. And the events in Forest Hills really had a ripple effect across the city. The borough president of Manhattan remarked on the deluge of applications, that's his term, that his office received to serve on community boards after the events in Forest Hills. And he directly attributed that to the events in Forest Hills. One community board member observed after all this, "It's as though we all thought participatory democracy was a grand idea until we tried it." So you start to see in New York City the results, for better and for worse, of anti-growth activism's influence. But if you can spare one last transcontinental trip with me, it's really back in California that you start to see all these different strains of thinking come together, to coalesce into what you might call like an anti-growth synthesis, a coherent politics of how anti-growth ought to inflect kind of all aspects of one's political identity as a liberal. As one San Diego newspaper columnist put it, the state in this era was giving birth to what he called a new Californian, with attitudes characterized by a proprietary concern for his setting rather more than for his society. By the 80s, all development within a certain distance of the California coast, as well as any development that could be construed as having an impact on the environment, was subject to new regulation. And in many places, new growth controls went even further. Cities and suburbs rolled out tougher zoning laws, neighborhood approval requirements, and in San Francisco's case, some of you may know, even a prohibition on new buildings casting shadows on public parks. One reporter summarized, "Nobody, no matter how law-abiding, has the absolute right to build anything." So I want us to think about this phenomenon in the context of a kind of a graph, a long axis of kind of state power versus individual power, local control versus kind of top-down control. Because in some ways, these new growth control laws that emerged from this era of California politics are a dramatic expansion of government's ability to dictate the use and the appearance of private property. But I think it's really interesting when you look kind of at the granular details of these laws, how they incorporated the fashionable forms of small-scale participatory democracy that we've just been talking about in New York City. Oh yeah, I should explain these. Here you just have, this is a great example in Santa Barbara. There is a discussion over a citywide plan to cap housing growth. I love how blunt it is in asking how many people should there be. And on the right here, you have an advertisement taken out by an anti-high-rise group in San Francisco in the 80s. This was a big issue in San Francisco in the 80s, was the so-called Manhattanization of San Francisco. And again, I love how blunt the political messaging is here. Okay, so one example of how this was happening in California was the California Coastal Commission, which was created by statewide referendum in 1972. Now, at first glance, the structure of the Coastal Commission seemed to run contrary to the low trust in centralized government that was characteristic of 70s liberalism. What it did was, and Proposition 20, for reference, is the proposition that created the Coastal Commission, you had a new series of regional mini-commissions staffed by elected officials, which were overseen by a new statewide board, which were empowered to regulate development within a certain distance of the coast. Initially, it was 1,000 yards from the coast, and then it was later expanded, I believe, to 5 miles, but don't quote me on that. But it's certainly much larger than 1,000 yards, and that's the kind of coastal zone that exists to this day. So this seems like a lot of new bureaucracy, and in some ways it is. But the commissions relied in large part on the work of ordinary citizens who could attend hearings and testify about the pros and cons of proposed developments. In fact, the ballot measure that created the Coastal Commission specified that any aggrieved party could appeal one of the local commission's decisions to the statewide commission. And the California Supreme Court later strengthened this aspect when they ruled that parties who were requesting construction permits from the commission were required to shoulder the cost of citizens' appeals. And in this way, the justices argued the public was going to be allowed to participate in the land use process on equal terms with developers. The official text of the proposition read, "Your yes vote will give the people direct participation in planning. No important decisions will be made until the citizen is heard." I love this. This is literature put out by some of the pro-Coastal Commission nonprofits. I love this line here: "A thin line of watchful citizens working to protect the wild and beautiful Northern California coast," because that really was the kind of vision, was that it'd be based on citizen activism, on that, I guess, a thin green line, if you will. So environmental groups such as COAST, which is the Californians Organized to Acquire Access to State Tidelands, I believe, as well as the Sierra Club, they recognized this fact early on, and they hired coast watchers and coastal coordinators to serve as watchdogs for the commissions and to establish a consistent anti-development presence at their hearings. And these citizen participants, when the commissions would vote in their favor, they would cheer. When they voted against, they would boo. And this power, one commissioner later said, was immense, the power of that opprobrium or approval. And this was confirmed by academic research, which found that when 5 or more people testified against a project at a hearing, commissioners were nearly 10 times more likely to reject a permit. So the coastal commissions were not the only growth control tool Californians had at their disposal. Another was an initially obscure law called the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. Now, CEQA had a very kind of boilerplate, mundane text. Its passage received very little attention from newspapers. The LA Times did not even devote a full article to its passage when it was passed in 1970. A lot of the text was actually copy-pasted from the National Environmental Protection Act. And so it was really not something that people paid very much attention to at first. And this is 1970 when it passes. So that's the case for a couple of years. But that all changes in 1972, when the state Supreme Court, in a decision known as Friends of Mammoth, ruled that CEQA's requirements did not merely apply to government activity. In fact, they apply to any instance in which the state regulates private activity. And that's a direct quote from the opinion. So all of a sudden, one lobbyist wrote, CEQA now seemed to apply to anybody engaged commercially in putting 2 sticks of wood together. And this came as a kind of shock, even to some of the people who voted for the law. In San Francisco, the city declared a temporary halt to new building, plumbing, and electrical permits until this decision could be clarified, while LA continued to issue permits, but did so with a disclaimer that said that the city could not be held liable in the event that the permit was later found to be illegal. So even the author of the bill in the legislature, who supported the Friends of Mammoth decision, called this reach pretty wild. And within a year, government agencies across California were preparing 4,000 environmental impact statements. That was the main thing that CEQA required you to do. You had to produce an environmental impact statement. So, a report on the impact on the environment of whatever project you were talking about. So at first glance, the coastal commissions and CEQA might not seem that similar, other than the fact that they had this kind of broad, general concern for California's environment. But there were 2 crucial points they had in common. While superficially neutral on the question of development, they both served as de facto, if not de jure, checks on urban growth. This was built into their very design. The only practical legal authority the coastal commissions possessed, they could come out with reports and issue guidelines, but the only practical legal authority they had was to reject the granting of construction permits. And CEQA's environmental impact statements were much the same in how they added a new hurdle to the development process that hadn't existed before. And CEQA, like the Coastal Commission, sought to accomplish these goals by small-scale empowerment of individual Californians. The Mammoth decision, and this was confirmed a few years later in a different ruling, the Mammoth decision made clear CEQA gave any citizen or group the legal standing to sue developers and governments to compel them to produce a sufficiently detailed environmental impact statement for a given project. These EISs, they didn't have to be predisposed toward a certain view, and they were not. They were not inherently anti-growth in that sense. But their main practical purpose of CEQA thus became to serve as a hurdle in the development process. A 1970s handbook for environmental organizations advised readers CEQA-related lawsuits have a number of advantages, including extensive delay, which may even force the developer to abandon his plans. And between 1972 and 1975, roughly a fifth of the Bay Area's total housing production, 29,000 proposed homes, were subject to CEQA litigation. So CEQA had a really palpable effect on the development process. And at first, many environmental impact statements in the state were just a few pages long. And you even have a great example of San Francisco Planning Commissioner complaining in 1972 that a 12-page environmental impact statement that had landed in his inbox was just intolerably long. But this very quickly changes, as the people laughing are well aware. Just 4 years later, a plan by UC Berkeley to build 2 new dorms resulted in an EIS that ran 950 pages. And that is not even close to the record. There's the canceled nuclear plant, I believe the San Joaquin nuclear plant, had like a 4,000-page environmental impact statement. And of course, the plant was never built. By 1975, the LA government was spending $4 million a year and assigning 230 employees to work on EISs. And it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, these massive reports were unlikely to be read by anyone unless they figured in a lawsuit. The head of the state's Office of Planning Research even later confessed that during his entire time in office, he did not read a single one. So, like with the New York City community boards, CEQA and the coastal commissions served their growth control functions by rearranging the mechanisms of state power to cede unprecedented influence over land use to small groups of citizens. And this really meant a new role for the individual, ordinary Californian, government watchdog. State and local agencies, of course, were nominally in charge of all of these things, but they did their work now knowing that it was subject to constant and legally actionable scrutiny from concerned citizens, homeowners associations, and environmental nonprofits. And I say all this while glossing over the equally significant changes that were taking place in California at the local level. In Santa Barbara, one UCSB professor won election to the County Board of Supervisors on a platform that had only one plank: not one more house in Santa Barbara. And in a particularly frenzied stretch between 1978 and 1981, voters in 20 different cities and counties across California enacted slow growth laws via ballot measure. One San Diego developer even took out a tongue-in-cheek advertisement in the local newspaper for one of his projects, and it proclaimed, "Discover this San Diego community. It'll be 42% empty when it's full." In Marin County, like you see here on the right, voters rejected a bond initiative that would have expanded the county's water supply for fear that it might encourage more development, even though the results of this was eventually a critical shortage of water that meant building an emergency pipeline across the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. This pipeline was in place for several years. I love this photo because it kind of encapsulates, how the pro-growth infrastructure of California's past was supporting the anti-growth infrastructure of its present. So what you start to see in California, in large part, but not exclusively, but in large part through, as a result of growth control measures, is a really crazy real estate environment by the time you get into the late 70s. Statewide, the price of the average home grew 150% between 1974 and 1978, while in greater LA, new home prices increased 28% between 1975 and 76 alone. Now, some of this was due to inflation, but I'm compressing a much longer part of my project here. I assure you it was not all inflation. In fact, it was not mostly inflation. It was mostly the scarcity of homes. Speculation, as you might imagine, became rampant. By the spring of 1977, it was estimated that as much as a fifth of all new homes across California's urban areas were being purchased by people who had no intention of living in them. And this runaway housing market, as many people feel today, had the effect of making a large group of Californians feel downwardly mobile, even if they were nominally financially secure. One September Sunday in 1976, more than 2,000 families lined a street in Irvine to bid on 82 houses. The New York Times reported people were fighting and scratching and arguing over who was at the front of the line. And in another nearby bidding war, 65 families camped out for a chance to build 29 new houses. Unfortunately for them, it ended up being the state's worst tropical storm in memory. In Santa Barbara, the local carpenters union guessed that 500 of its members had been priced out of the city, and the Chamber of Commerce started to have trouble attracting firms to what was arguably, if you've ever been to Santa Barbara, the most pleasant place in America. One executive there put it, "We can't move our employees here. They'd starve to death." So by the 90s, a study from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy counted 907 growth control measures across California, more than half of which I'm not even going into here because they had been enacted in the 1980s. Anti-growth politics, they concluded, had become an epidemic socio-political phenomenon. And Democratic politicians, for their part, were mostly willing to position themselves as defenders of this broad array of neighborhood groups and their values, whether you're talking about environmentalists, preservationists, homeowners, and even, to a certain extent, tenant activists. And that's a whole other part of my project that I've had to gloss over today. And they did so in the face of mounting evidence that anti-growth politics were helping bring about dire social consequences. In 1984, a feature in New York Magazine reported on the misery of the housing squeeze in New York City. The vacancy rate in Manhattan had dipped below 2%, forcing, and this is a quote, normal adults over 30 to live with roommates for the first time in memory. So think about that. This is 1984. And of course, at the same time, you have a growing cohort of what planners now call supercommuters, people who lived way outside the city and commuted 90 minutes or 2 hours or more to their places of employment every day. And here I love this depiction. So this is because there's an anecdote in this article where a couple who owned a New York City apartment together got divorced, but decided not to move out because they were afraid that neither one could afford a better apartment than the one they already had. So they essentially decided to split the apartment in two, and they decided to split the days of the week when each one was allowed to have company over. So, of course, many people in growth-controlled cities simply stopped being able to afford permanent housing altogether. Before 1983, and I was surprised to learn this, New York City had so few homeless people that the city government didn't even bother keeping track of how many there were. In the early 80s, however, the population suddenly exploded and surpassed 10,000 people by 1983, 20,000 by 1985, and nearly reached 30,000 in 1987. And as anyone here who's been to the Bay Area can attest, in San Francisco, things were not much better and in some ways quite worse. So here you have Mayor Dianne Feinstein on the left touring a homeless encampment, and Mayor Ed Koch on the right. So to wrap up this talk, when we talk about the legacy of anti-growth politics today, I do think these are the issues we have to put front and center when we contrast it with ideas about NIMBYism. Moving away from NIMBYism helps us understand that the people in this story were not always greedy or self-interested, though certainly that was sometimes the case. Quite often, they were addressing problems that were very real to them in their own times, in ways that they believed were truer to liberalism's spirit than what had come before. But understanding these historical actors as more complex characters also means that the problems that they created have greater stakes. In the end, participants in the growth revolt helped sow the seeds of what is today, just as in the 60s, I would argue, a profound crisis of legitimacy facing American liberalism itself. So to return to this map, it's true that cities in our federal system do not wield that much political power. But it's also simply the case that the Democratic Party to this day has not expressed that much concern about the urban affordability crisis happening in its voters' own backyards. And while it's undeniable that the localist orientation that gave rise to anti-growth politics was itself a legitimate response to the excesses and injustices of urban renewal, this local orientation also meant the greatest successes of anti-growth politics today are enjoyed only locally. And you see this in particular when we talk about the environmental side of anti-growth politics. While many American suburbs that now form the backbone of the Democratic Party have stopped the bulldozers near where they live, pretty much every metro area in the US, whether blue or red, has continued to sprawl outwards as developers simply hopscotched over the areas that had housing restrictions and continued to build further and further out of the city center. In cities, you see a kind of analogous phenomenon. Local growth controls, whether in the form of historic districts, zoning, or what have you, mean that when you talk about, say, San Francisco, a good portion of the city is frozen in amber. Here's a map of neighborhoods where you have single-family houses in San Francisco. But development has been concentrated in a few corridors that are not as good at fighting back. And this broad growth restriction, combined with local growth exceptions, is a perfect recipe for what we've come to call gentrification, which you see here on the left. This is a study that came out recently of displacement-prone neighborhoods across San Francisco. and you see it's almost an exact mirror image of the areas that are single-family only. But probably the biggest legacy of anti-growth politics is simply the ever-increasing cost of housing in America, which is itself the biggest component of a broader cost of living crisis that the country now faces. And growth control is not the only cause of this phenomenon, but it's certainly one of the biggest ones in the areas where Americans, as well as immigrants to America, most desire to live. Even the trough after the Great Recession, as you see here, even with that, housing prices are now above the peaks of the boom economies of the late 20th century. And in 2024, we are now basically in uncharted territory. Now, this is a very good proposition if you happen to own real estate, but it's a very bad one if you are anyone else. And its effects are not concentrated locally, or even limited to those particular regions that I've talked about today, or to voters of one political persuasion. On the contrary, they ripple out across the country and are felt up and down its social structure. Americans, particularly young Americans, as you see here, they're more stuck in place now than at any point in the post-war era. And not coincidentally, the growing degree to which people's wealth is bound up in their homes has prompted some staggering generational differences, which I think it is safe to say turn into appreciable differences in quality of life. Now, this chart on the right that you see is going to change as propertied baby boomers begin to die off and their children inherit their real estate. But I don't need to point out that the process implied there, a country where social mobility is dependent on transfers of land from parents to children, is not only inimical to the values widely understood to be at the heart of American liberalism, it's not social mobility at all. And those less fortunate, meanwhile, will remain effectively unable to gain access to high opportunity places like New York, San Francisco, Boston. And that's going to foment anger and frustration at an economy and a political system that have left them behind. And if the last 8 years of American politics is any indication, I think that anger and frustration is already here. Thank you.
Thank you. Your research was super interesting, especially as a preservation student. And I think that in the past generation, preservation has obviously had a huge change in face and is now being looked at as one of the solutions to affordable housing. And I was really wondering what your perspective was on that, and if you think that's an effective new way to look at preservation.
Yeah, so I think it depends largely what kind of preservation we're talking about, what are the laws and the strictures in question, and more importantly, where are we talking about it, right? So part of why the affordability crisis in places like Manhattan that I argue was created in part by the wave of preservation, part of why that happened, why that effect did not occur to people or why people didn't care about it that much, was we're talking about an era when housing in these places was largely affordable, right? So I think it's important to understand that history because the process that worked in New York City or Boston or other places, or Georgetown, Washington, D.C., places where you had large historic districts put in place, really didn't create affordable housing. What it did was it made housing expensive. And this was seen largely by preservationists of that era as a benefit. You had cities that were not unaffordable. You had neighborhoods that were kind of bombed out that had beautiful architecture, and restrictions on development was, in the preservationist view, one way to guarantee that if you bought a house in that neighborhood, you would be able to resell it for something similar to what you bought it for or more. And so I do find that shift is pretty funny because I don't think we have great evidence of preservation being able to create affordable housing these days. And in fact, I find, particularly when it's talked about in the New York City context, it's funny that is cited as a reason for preservation, and yet at the same time, another trend you're seeing in preservation recently is a focus more on landmarking kind of historic neighborhoods of color. And one reason that is going on, one reason that's been cited for that is to give homeowners of color the same benefits of kind of scarce, preserved housing that a generation, 2 generations ago were given to kind of the white brownstoners who I mentioned here. So I think in the context of high demand cities with scarce housing, I think we have to think really hard about whether preservation achieves that end. There are plenty of cities where there is low demand for housing, where preservation is warranted because of the quality and beauty of those cities' architecture, where I don't think preservation would have, in the short term or the medium term, that effect on the housing market. So you think about like the industrial Midwest, post-industrial Midwest. I think those are places where you could have kind of active preservation movements today that, and not worry about creating an affordability crisis. But in terms of preservation itself, assuring affordability, I suppose I'm not quite convinced by that idea. Thank you.
Hello, it's a very wonderful presentation. And you have used the word ideology in the research for many times. Yeah. And it seems it have various understanding of the terms. I'm quite interested in your definition of political ideology in the research.
Yeah, so I definitely use the term more loosely than some political theorists, and I tend to like the definition that I mentioned that was put forward by Eric Foner, which is ideology is kind of where values and interests converge, right? So, and I guess this goes back to Clifford Geertz too. It's a kind of map of how the world works and how the world ought to work that takes into account one's kind of own material position in society, but also values that may not map on perfectly to one's kind of material position. And there's a lot of research from political scientists on how, you know, the kind of party system in the US in particular functions as a bulwark against people having ideological views that are too inconsistent. How, or put another way, how if you think of yourself as a liberal, maybe you have one or two issues that you care a lot about. Maybe it's being pro-choice, maybe it's housing affordability, environmentalism, whatever. So you have issues that you kind of understand deeply and you care about. But then you have a lot of other issues that you don't really care that much about, but which the kind of political system wants you to care about. And how do you determine your views on those issues? You determine them through kind of ideological identity and party identity. You say, as a liberal, I am being told by other liberals that I ought to feel a certain way about this issue that I don't personally care that much about, and so I will feel that way and vote that way and support politicians who vote that way. And it's the same thing in the US with strong kind of parties, where as a Democrat, you might support a certain issue because you identify as a Democrat. And I think that that's an important factor in this story because, as I said at the beginning, most people didn't care that much about growth one way or the other. They're kind of uncommitted. But how do you get like majorities to support anti-growth measures? It's through this kind of inchoate associational gel of party and ideology. Yeah, thank you for that.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question is, with cities like San Francisco and New York City that are still seeing the aftermath of anti-growth policies, do you see the future of urbanization in changing the policies restricting development within these cities, or a movement to affordable housing development in other American cities?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think both. I think predominantly the latter, because the political system's ability to change the laws that created this crisis that we were talking about today, invariably moves more slowly than people making a certain amount of money and having to figure out whether they can live in a certain city on that amount of money. And so, I think it's quite remarkable. You're seeing in California population decline in cities in California that have booming economies. And as a historian, I'm really not aware of many precedents for having population decline in parts of America because those places are too prosperous, right? So I think that the flight of people from the kind of what Paul Krugman called the zoned zone, the Northeast and the West Coast, toward the Sun Belt has to be understood as the kind of predominant phenomenon as a result of this anti-growth politics. That being said, there's good work being done in all these places by housing advocates in favor of expanding supply who are hoping to kind of turn back that tide. But I think we're very far from the point where that's going to appreciably redirect the kind of trend of migration away from the expensive coasts and toward the cheaper Sunbelt areas.
I have a question. So when I think about like New York with Hochul this year, kind of, wanting to build more affordable housing, but then having it fall apart because of, a lot of communities outside New York, which are, largely liberal. Your story makes a lot of sense to me. But when I'm actually looking at some of the history that you're talking about, I mean, a lot of that is, during the Reagan years in California, and also New York, California really wasn't a blue state until, in 92, so I'm just kind of curious then about sort of, really do politics and ideology, sort of play so much of an important role, as opposed to, like you said, sort of self-interest in some of these other issues?
Yeah, so it's a very good point, and I think one thing that I necessarily oversimplify in these talks, necessarily gloss over, is how the trend of these places becoming more polarized in a partisan sense, and the trend of them kind of adopting these anti-growth laws and policies, those are happening kind of at the same time, but not at the same pace, which becomes a very difficult thing to talk about as a historian, because you're absolutely right that, a San Diegan in the 80s who supports an anti-growth measure is probably not a Democrat. But by the time you get to 2020, they probably are, right? And if you talk about someone from Marin County in the 60s, they're making that shift much earlier. And so there's a kind of a lot of different, spinning plates that are up in the air in terms of how people are coming to identify as liberals at the same time, but not necessarily at the same pace as how they're coming to identify as growth opponents. However, I think in the kind of broad sense, it remains true, the kind of thrust of the narrative remains true in the sense that these places, whether you're talking about kind of suburban conservatives who through being socially moderate and through being environmentally conscientious are finding a home within the Democratic Party, or you're talking about urban liberals who were always Democrats and are kind of having their views on growth change to go along with the kind of trend that's happening in their neighborhoods or in other parts of their metro area. Whichever group you're talking about, it's remaining the case that those groups are over time making their way into the kind of Democratic coalition, and I'm arguing are able to find places within the Democratic coalition as a result of changes in the priorities of liberalism that became much more open toward kind of anti-growth ideas. So you're right that it's a much more complex story in terms of the timeline of people coming to identify as liberals through this politics, but I think particularly when you see how these places continue to trend more democratic in every political cycle, to the point where, in the last election, if in the 60s you start to see Marin County move from the right to the left, by 2020 you start to see like the Indianapolis suburbs move from the right to the left. I think that broader phenomenon is still shaping this story. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Hello. I was just wondering if you had any localized knowledge of, or like if in your research you came across any information about the history of housing affordability in or around Ithaca, or any themes in planning generally.
No, if I had known I was going to get this postdoc when I was writing the dissertation, I definitely would have. In part because it probably would have made me even more appealing to Cornell as a postdoc candidate. But having moved to Ithaca myself and having looked for housing, and now being a homeowner in Ithaca, which is not something that I anticipated wanting to do when I got the postdoc, but was kind of encouraged to do by the nature of Ithaca's housing market, I see Ithaca as kind of the next frontier in these trends that I've been talking about, which is to say, I think for a long time, and the people who've lived in Ithaca for a while can attest to this, Ithaca was not considered a high demand place to live. And so it was acceptable to have a kind of stagnant housing stock in the city. And it's really, I think since COVID, and we can debate the reasons for that, but I suspect people wanting to move to areas with kind of a lot of recreational activities and scenic beauty like Ithaca, that played a certain role. Ithaca has come to face that demand crunch and that limit, the effects of that limit on supply that you saw 40, 50, 60 years ago in New York City or in San Francisco. And I think Ithaca is probably approaching a political moment, if it's not already there, where Ithaca liberals, which is basically everyone here, right, have to decide what stance on growth they're going to take. And what's undeniable is that demand in the near term is going to continue to encourage development. But where do you see development in Ithaca? Right now, it's on like the edges of Tompkins County, right? It's sprawling development. And so the question of whether more housing needs to be built in kind of more centrally located parts of the city, I think that's a political question that we have yet to face. Not to mention, that doesn't even get into the whole question of how property tax revenues are going to go up quite a bit this year because of kind of the spike in housing prices last year and what that means for people's political views here.
I also have a question. First of all, thank you for your talk. My question was about the people who were expressing themselves during throughout the time periods that you were mentioning. So was there any like demographic changes or shifts? So maybe one period where youths were more active versus another. I was wondering if you could just speak more to that.
Demographic shifts in the neighborhoods that I mentioned, or?
Yeah, in the neighborhoods, like throughout this like anti-growth, thoughts and like these movements and stuff, who is participating in them?
I see. Yeah, that's a good question. So predominantly, as you may have gleaned from this talk, this is a story of, I wouldn't call them a group of political elites, because they're not like elected officials, and for the most part, they're not people who work in Washington. They're kind of the elites of the grassroots, which is to say they are upper middle to upper class, kind of white collar, largely white, highly politically involved actors in this story, who, you can argue that maybe I give them too much attention, but I think they were really the main movers. And when you talk about the reconfiguration of the Democratic Party after the 60s, you have a lot of groups who kind of had long been voting Democratic and remain in the Democratic coalition. But I do think it's these people who really helped dictate the reconfiguration of the party and played quite a big role in making the Democratic Party support the policies that it does today. That being said, one thing that I don't mention in this talk at all, in part because it's in a chapter that I'm in the middle of writing, is how this movement of anti-growthers, by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, it's no longer acceptable, and this gets to the question of kind of ideology, the role of ideology here. It's no longer acceptable to support anti-growth policies without explaining how those policies fit a kind of broader racial justice effort. And so there you start to see the emergence of people, and both white people and people of color, entering the anti-growth fold by supporting policies, anti-growth policies, as a way to prevent gentrification. And this happens, I'm focusing in this chapter largely on New York and San Francisco again. And that's how I think you turn anti-growth from a largely, for lack of a better term, a largely white movement focused on the interests of, largely white upper middle class Democrats, into one that has, at least on the surface, much more of a kind of a much more racially diverse coalition that's focused on issues that pertain more to racial equality. Now, I would argue, and this is a debate that's far from settled, that using anti-growth as a tool of preventing gentrification has largely been proven to fail. In fact, as I imply in that last slide, or second to last slide there, I think the restrictions on development, in fact, kind of jumpstart gentrification. But that gets into a whole question of, what is my position as a historian in terms of casting judgment on the motivations or the results of people's political work. But I do think that is an important shift to answer your question in this story. By the time you get to the end of the 20th century, it becomes much more an imperative for these groups, these political groups, to focus on the fact that you are seeing racial displacement in a lot of these neighborhoods.
Hello. This was one of the most compelling talks I personally have been to, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on emerging research on the climate crisis, where the new havens tend to be in the Midwest or upstate New York from cities like Miami, Louisiana, LA, New York City. Are these geographies of affordable housing, do you see that shifting? Or I just was curious on your thoughts about that in relation to climate migration.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, I suppose I have a kind of historian's skepticism toward the idea that we're going to see those shifts, like in my lifetime. They may, my mom lives in Miami, and I was just down to visit her, and let me tell you, people who live in Miami are perfectly happy living in Miami, and really, like, despite the substantial evidence that they may not, that it's going to be quite dangerous and stressful for them to continue living in Miami, like, no one there is talking about moving to Duluth. However, if we assume that that is what happens over the long term, and I think, and by long term, we're talking timescales of centuries here, you know, that it may be beneficial for those kind of post-industrial cities that don't currently have housing shortages. They have issues of endemic poverty, but not housing shortages. That may help to kind of rectify the imbalance of supply and demand in the national housing market. However, when we're talking about those timescales, there's so many other hypotheticals we're getting into. It's like, aliens may have come and vaporized the U.S., and then it won't be an issue at all. And no, that's a bit of an exaggeration. But when you start to think on timescales like that, historians tend to get very hesitant because there's just so many other factors that could influence that. So while I'm inclined to say, we should all move to Duluth because it's affordable and will be, protected from the climate crisis, it's hard to say with any precision that is going to be the way of the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Jake, for a wonderful talk. I have a question about right-wing anti-growth politics. In 2019, Donald Trump said our country is full. I remember seeing a T-shirt a couple of years ago. Some guy in Montana, of all places, said there's no room here, in one of our largest states with the smallest population. Obviously, this ties up with xenophobia and anti-immigration sentiment, but I was wondering what you make of the fact that this is no longer situated mainly or primarily on the political left.
Yeah, that's a great question, Larry. So yes, it is interesting that when we talk about the 70s, it is very acceptable for self-identified liberals to say things like the country is full. And this gets to the question about the changing composition of the anti-growth coalitions, as well as whether they're identifying, as liberals or not. And you'd have this schism in the late 90s, I believe, where the Sierra Club starts to develop a kind of immigration policy, I believe, in the 60s, and they take quite a strong anti-immigration stance. And you have a schism in the 90s where I believe the Sierra Club votes to abolish that policy or to maybe, I forget the details, adopt a much more pro-immigrant policy, which I think is a sign of the influence being exerted on environmentalism by other elements of the Democratic Party. That decision, which happened in my lifetime, really pushes those anti-immigrant sentiments permanently, or at least for the time being, onto the right. So it becomes uncouth and unacceptable if you're a liberal to express ideas, to express anti-immigration ideas because they've come in tension with other liberal ideas about America being a beacon of opportunity, et cetera, as well as the fact that you just have a lot of right-wing, far-right politicians who are just very anti-immigrant, which I think further discredits the issue among liberals. So then I think what happens in the 90s is if you're an anti-growther and you're a liberal, you have to look for ways to reconcile the fact that you are pro-immigration nominally with the fact that you don't particularly like growth in the places where you live. And you still hold these beliefs, I think, for a lot of people that growth on some level is detrimental. So how do you do that? One way is through a kind of local focus, because if you're talking about the level of the city or the level of the neighborhood, you can talk about zoning in terms that are much more favorable to you as a liberal than talking about population growth at a national scale. So that's one way you do it. Another way you do it, I think, is by supporting certain kinds of immigration that effectively limit population growth, but don't seem as anti-immigrant as the things that conservatives support. So I think about like the left of center embrace of the idea of sort of I'm forgetting the term of art here. There's a term of art liberals start to use in the 90s to support the immigration of kind of high skill foreign workers, and the idea that these immigrants are particularly desirable because they, in kind of liberals' meritocratic sense of how things ought to work, they contribute these skills and these talents to our economy. And by doing that, you're both separating yourselves from conservatives who are anti-immigrant across the board, and also separating yourself from the idea that immigration overall is a kind of unalloyed good. And I think that it's not a coincidence that you start to see Democrats embrace that idea of being pro-immigration, but particularly high-skill workers. And you can welcome the high-skill workers. They will live in kind of wealthy suburbs, and at the same time, we'll beef up border security because that's important too. And so I think that the position you see the Democrats take on immigration today is reflective of that desire to appear outwardly welcoming to immigrants on some level, while still maintaining, kind of exporting the harms of growth to foreign countries while keeping the lucre of kind of economic growth flowing into American cities through that high school immigration. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Hello? Hi, Jake. And echo the sentiments that this was a wonderful talk and also great images.
Oh, thank you.
I'm kind of interested in this idea that the anti-growth movement kind of came about very quickly as a consequence of suburbanization and urban renewal. Like you kind of describe it as a movement that came about in the 60s and the 70s, right? Right as these things were continuing to happen. But can you talk a little bit about why it is that with housing affordability being kind of like a crisis for the last 30 plus years, that we haven't been able to kind of see a kind of not a reversal, but kind of like another strong movement in increasing housing supply and affordability in the same way?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that, well, for one, you are starting to see that, but it really is only in the last 10 years, and that's even being generous, that you start to see the so-called NIMBY groups pop up who are in favor of rolling back these local restrictions and expanding housing supply that way. I think it's really just a result of the broader phenomenon that, well, a couple things. One, that it is very difficult to reverse direction when you're dealing with not just discrete policy priorities, but something as kind of complicated and much more embedded as a political ideology. So, in order for the NIMBY movements to succeed, they not only have to win fights about individual, zoning overlays or what have you, they have to convince left of center people that their previous belief system has really no longer applies, has been discredited, is no longer consistent with the priorities of liberalism. And this was something that that the anti-growthers did quite successfully. However, it took them quite a long time as well. You start to see these movements in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but it takes decades for them to spread across the country, to the point where, as I mentioned in passing, it's the 80s is like the peak decade of anti-growth activism in California, even though, as a historian, because I like to trace the origins of these movements, I prefer to focus on a slightly earlier time frame. So these things just take a long time. And I think what the anti-growthers had that the pro-growthers today don't necessarily have yet, though they may be getting there, is that kind of complete discrediting of the previous iteration of liberalism that was made kind of so clear and so blatant and so obvious by the failures of the urban renewal era. Our affordability crisis today is severe. It's pricing people out of metro areas. It's reconfiguring our political system. But we almost don't have that visual element that the urban renewal era had, where we point to, you can't point to a building that doesn't exist and say, this is the symbol of the housing crisis because the building doesn't exist. Whereas the anti-growthers were able to point to the highways that were rammed through cities and the historic buildings, that were faced with the wrecking ball. And I think they were helped by the fact that this goes back to my describing this as a spatial ideology. The aesthetic qualities of the urban renewal era and their shortcomings were so visceral and so perceptible in a way that our present housing problem is not really.
Well, thank you so much again for your talk. This was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.